There's a before and after in every family, a quiet moment where the ground shifts and nothing goes back to how it was. For my family, that moment happened on a Sunday evening in September around a dining room table in Dayton, Ohio. It started with one cruel sentence my sister said to my 9-year-old daughter when she thought I wasn't listening. My family called what I did next an overreaction. But stay with me, because by the time I'm done, you'll want to call somebody yourself. Welcome to Dad's Ultimate Payback. Get comfortable, hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss a second of this. My name is Dave Lewis. I'm 39, a project manager living in Riverside, a quiet neighborhood on the west side of Dayton. It's a clean home with a big backyard where my daughter, Emma Grace, knows every dog on the block. Emma's mom, Josephine, and I split up years ago, but we co-parent well. Emma lives with her in Kettering, but I get her every other weekend and Wednesday night. I guard those days like gold. That Sunday, I'd had Emma since Friday. By evening, we were at my mother's house on Glenmore Avenue for our monthly family dinner, before dropping her back at Josephine's. My mother, Gloria, still lives in our childhood home. Every second Sunday, everyone gathers there. My sister Betty, Uncle Gary, Aunt Linda, and my cousins. Mom always made a traditional Midwest feast: fried chicken, mac and cheese, cornbread, and homemade pumpkin pie. Emma loved those dinners, but as I walked out of the kitchen carrying warm cornbread, I felt a sudden heavy drop in the atmosphere. I looked at Emma first. She was sitting stiffly, hands pressed in her lap, shoulders hunched up. Beside her, Aunt Betty was casually cutting her chicken, completely unbothered. Right then, my cousin's 6-year-old son reached for the last slice of warm pumpkin pie, Emma's favorite dessert, the piece Mom had set aside for her. Before Emma could speak, Betty grabbed the plate and handed it directly to the boy. Emma blinked, her voice trembling. "Aunt Betty, Grandma said that slice was." Betty cut her off with an icy, dismissive glare. "You should know your place in this house, Emma," Betty sneered loudly, her voice dripping with condescension in front of everyone. "A child born out of wedlock needs to learn how to be humble and step back. You're lucky you're even invited to these family dinners." The entire room went dead silent. Uncle Gary froze. Cousin Brett stared at his plate. Nobody said a word. Emma bowed her head, lip quivering, and quietly slipped away. I followed her down the hallway and heard quiet, muffled sobbing behind the bathroom door. I opened it softly. My sweet 9-year-old girl was sitting on the edge of the bathtub, tears streaming down her cheeks. I knelt beside her, wrapping my arm around her shaking shoulders. "Tell me, Bug," I whispered gently. Emma wiped her eyes, her voice cracking. "Aunt Betty said I was a mistake, Daddy. She said I was born out of wedlock and that the whole family is embarrassed that I'm here." Standing in that bathroom, holding my sobbing daughter, something inside me snapped with absolute finality. Betty thought she could humiliate an innocent child to feed her own bitter ego. She had no idea that she had just ignited a fire that would tear her comfortable world completely apart. I walked back into that dining room with Emma's small hand gripped tightly in mine. 8 people were sat around the table, the mac and cheese still steaming, football noise drifting in from the living room TV. Normal Sunday, nothing to see here. I stood at my end of the table and stared directly at my sister. Betty glanced up, took a calm sip of her ice water, and set her glass down without a flinch. "Betty," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "what did you say to Emma?" The table shifted uncomfortably. Uncle Gary looked up from his plate. Brett put his phone face down. Betty let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh, as if my presence alone was exhausting her. "I just told her the truth, Dave. Kids need to understand reality eventually. She is 9 years old." I leaned over the table, keeping my tone ice cold. "She was crying alone in the bathroom. She processed that her own family doesn't want her here. Is that the truth you wanted her to know?" Betty folded her arms across her chest with an expression that was aggressively unbothered. "She was born out of wedlock, Dave. That's a biological fact. I didn't say anything bad. You're being dramatic. She'll be fine." My mother gently reached over and patted my arm. "Dave, honey, let's just finish dinner. The food's getting cold." Uncle Gary cleared his throat, adding, "She didn't mean any harm, son." Brett picked his phone back up, and Cousin Kelly looked down at her plate. Nobody defended my daughter. Their collective response to a 9-year-old being called a mistake was asking me to sit down and eat my fried chicken. "Let's go, Bug," I said softly to Emma. I looked at my mother and said, "I'll call you later, Mom." Then I looked at Betty one last time. She was already reaching for another piece of chicken, utterly indifferent. After dropping Emma off at Josephine's house in Kettering, I drove back to my empty home in Riverside. I sat down at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, a black pen, and a mug of dark coffee. It was time to look at the numbers. For 3 years, I had been the primary financial guarantor for Betty's apartment on Brown Street near the Oregon District, quietly covering $900 of her $1,400 monthly rent. That was $3,400 I had funneled into her life. Her 2021 Honda Accord? I negotiated the deal and paid off $14,000 of the loan over 22 months, while keeping her on my auto insurance policy. 2 semesters at the University of Dayton when her financial aid fell short, $6,800 paid in full by me. The $3,500 MacBook when her laptop died. $600 for her 30th birthday trip to Nashville. Then I logged into my online banking app to review my recent statements. A fresh charge from earlier that very morning caught my eye and turned my blood to ice. Betty had used the authorized secondary credit card I gave her strictly for emergency car repairs, and swiped $200 at a high-end designer boutique at the Green Shopping Center for a luxury leather handbag. She had bought a $1,200 designer bag with my money at 10:30 a.m., and by 5 p.m., she was using the financial security I provided to sit at my mother's table and call my daughter a mistake. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the yellow legal pad covered in numbers, and felt a cold, unbreakable clarity settle over me. They thought I was the invisible backbone of the family who would always pay the bills and swallow the insults. They were about to learn what happens when that backbone steps away. Monday passed in quiet routine. On Tuesday morning, I sat at my desk with my yellow legal pad and made 3 short professional phone calls. The first call was to the property management company handling Betty's building on Brown Street. I officially requested to be removed as the primary financial guarantor on her lease, effective at the end of the billing cycle as permitted under my co-signature contract. They said they would notify her. I said that was fine. The second call was to my auto insurance provider to remove her 2021 Honda Accord from my policy. The third was a brief email to the billing office at the University of Dayton, notifying them that I would not be renewing the quarterly tuition installment for her continuing education certificate. 3 actions, 40 minutes total. I kept my monthly $900 automated transfer to my mother's bank account completely intact. That was for Mom, not Betty. Then I waited for the weather to change. It took 11 days. 11 peaceful days where I focused entirely on my daughter. I took Emma to her soccer practices at Eastwood Field on Wednesday and Thursday evenings. Watching her run across the grass in her red jersey, laughing and chasing the ball, was medicine for my soul. Slowly, the posture of a hurt child began to ease, though I knew the scar was still there. On the 11th day, a Thursday evening, my phone rang while I was making dinner. The caller ID flashed. Betty, I picked up. Hello, Betty, Dave! Her voice came shrieking through the speaker, 3 layers deep into controlled panic. My landlord just called me. He said you officially removed yourself as my lease guarantor, and that I need a new co-signer or a doubled security deposit by the end of the month. What the hell is going on? I updated my financial arrangements, I said calmly, stirring the sauce on the stove. Simplifying my expenses. You pulled out of my lease without telling me? She yelled. Dave, I can't cover this apartment on my own. You know that. I know, I replied flatly, a heavy pause. What does that mean, you know? Are you just going to let me get evicted? I'm not letting anything happen, Betty. I'm just no longer preventing it. There's a big difference. This is because of Sunday dinner. Her voice pitched higher, reframing herself as the victim. I cannot believe you are punishing me financially because your feelings got hurt over a conversation. You told my 9-year-old daughter she was a mistake in front of the whole family, I said, my tone dropping into steel. And when I addressed it, you told me I was being dramatic. Everyone at the table agreed with you. So I took everyone's advice. I stopped overreacting. I'm just spending my money differently now. That was when Betty completely lost her mind. You think you're so smart, Dave? She screamed into the receiver, her arrogance morphing into pure venom. If you don't call my landlord back right now and reinstate that guarantee, I swear to God, I will drive straight to your project management office in Riverside tomorrow morning. I will march right into your boss's office and tell everyone what kind of heartless monster you are for throwing your own sister out on the street. I stood in my quiet kitchen, holding the phone, feeling completely unmoved. Betty, I said, my voice dead level, ice cold, and terrifyingly clear. Before I made those calls on Tuesday, I printed out 3 years of certified bank statements showing every dollar I spent on your rent, your car, and your luxury shopping sprees, including the $1,200 designer purse you charged to my card last Sunday morning. I forwarded that entire dossier to my landlord contact and my attorney. If you set 1 foot on my employer's property in Riverside to harass me, I won't even come out to talk to you. The front desk will call the police, and you will be escorted off the premises in handcuffs for felony harassment. Try me. Absolute, deafening silence fell over the line. For the first time in her life, Betty realized she had 0 leverage left. Have a good night, Betty, I said softly, and hung up the phone. After I hung up on Betty, the rest of the family followed like dominoes. 2 days later, on Saturday morning, my phone rang while I was making breakfast for Emma. The screen showed my Uncle Gary. Gary is a decent man who genuinely means well, but he has a deep, instincts-driven urge to smooth things over, which often means he defends the wrong person just to avoid uncomfortable conflict. Dave, buddy, Gary said, road noise humming in the background as he drove. I heard from your mother that Betty's having some serious trouble with her apartment situation. She said you pulled out of something. Her lease, I said, flipping a pancake in the skillet. I ended my financial guarantee. Dave, look! I understand you were upset about what happened to dinner, Gary reasoned, his voice soothing. But don't you think cutting her off completely like this is a little extreme over a family disagreement? Uncle Gary, I asked calmly. How long have I been co-signing Betty's lease on Brown Street? I didn't actually know you were doing that, son. 3 years, at $900 a month. Do you know how much of her Honda Accord I paid off? A pause. No, I don't. $14,000, I said flatly. Plus her insurance, her University of Dayton tuition gap, her laptop, and her credit card bills. Over $50,000 of my hard-earned money over the last 3 years alone. Nobody at that dining table knew, because I never bragged about it. I just carried her quietly because I thought that's what family does. And then Betty sat at Mom's table, called my 9-year-old daughter a mistake, and the whole table told me I was overreacting. So I stopped overreacting, Gary. I just put down the bags. Silence heavy as lead hung on the line. $50,000? Gary whispered, completely stunned. I genuinely had no idea, Dave. I'm so sorry, son. I truly didn't know. I know you didn't, Uncle Gary. That's the whole point. On Sunday afternoon, my mother called from her landline on Glenmore Avenue. We did the usual routine for 2 minutes, asking if the heat was working and if Emma was eating well, before the real storm rolled in. Betty came by yesterday, Dave. Mom's voice trembled slightly. She's terrified. She might lose that apartment, honey. I know, Mom. Don't you think we can just— Mom, I cut in gently, sitting down at my kitchen table. Do you know what Emma asked her mother last week? She asked Josephine if her grandma was embarrassed of her. A 9-year-old girl is lying awake in bed wondering if her own grandmother is ashamed of her existence because of what Betty said over your fried chicken. Emma did nothing wrong, Mom. She just exists. And her aunt decided to educate her on family shame while everyone passed the cornbread. I heard my mother catch her breath over the phone. I love you, Mom, I continued, my voice steady but full of emotion. Your $900 comes on the first of every month like clockwork. That never changes. But do you want to protect Betty's entitlement, or do you care about the heart of your granddaughter? Because I can no longer fund a comfortable life for someone who attacks my child and calls it a favor. A soft, broken sob came from my mother's end. The weight of reality finally crashed through her years of passive enabling. She realized how deeply Betty had hurt Emma and how much I had silently cared for the family since Dad passed away. I'm so sorry, David, Mom wept quietly. I was so wrong. That afternoon, Mom did something she had never done before. She walked into her living room, picked up the framed picture of Betty that had sat on her mantelpiece for years, and put it away in a drawer. And when Betty called her an hour later begging to borrow $10,000 from Mom's retirement savings to cover her apartment deposit and credit card debts, Mom held her ground for the very first time. She told Betty flatly, "No, your brother is right. It is time for you to grow up." 3 weeks after that disastrous dinner on Glenmore Avenue, on a chilly Wednesday evening in October, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I had just picked Emma up from Josephine's for our midweek dinner, and she was sitting at my kitchen table, intensely focused on a science worksheet about clouds and the water cycle. I walked to the front door and opened it. Standing on my porch in the dim evening light was Betty. But this wasn't the arrogant, eye-rolling sister who had sat at Mom's dining table 3 weeks ago. She looked utterly drained, stripped of every ounce of her performative posture. Her hair was pulled back into a hasty, loose knot. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and she was wearing an old denim jacket I recognized from 4 years ago, back before I started bankrolling her designer wardrobe. I'm not here to fight, Dave, she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the threshold. I'm not here to ask for money or beg for my lease. I needed to come. I stood there for a long moment, looking at my sister, and then stepped aside to let her in. Emma looked up from her homework as we walked into the kitchen. For a second, her small face went completely still. A flicker of hesitation crossed her big brown eyes, a shadow of that painful Sunday night, before she slowly set her purple marker down. Betty stood frozen near the entryway, staring at Emma, looking utterly lost and completely empty of words. I was about to break the heavy silence when Emma quietly slid out of her chair. She walked over to her backpack hanging near the back door, dug around inside, and pulled out a carefully folded piece of notebook paper. She walked straight up to Betty and extended her small hand, holding out the folded paper. Betty looked at me, her hands trembling. I didn't say a word. I just nodded gently. Betty took the paper with unsteady fingers and unfolded it. I stepped closer so I could see over her shoulder. Written in Emma's neat, slightly oversized cursive, practiced with pencil and vibrant purple marker, was a note with a bright yellow sun drawn in the top corner. It read, "Dear Aunt Betty, my dad told me I wasn't a mistake. He said I was his whole reason and that I should never forget that. I looked up what out of wedlock means in the dictionary, and I don't think it means what you said it means. I forgive you because my dad says that's what strong people do even when it's hard, but I want you to know it really hurt my feelings, and I cried for a long time in the bathroom. I decided to tell you because I think you should know the truth. Love, Emma Grace Lewis. P.S. I am not embarrassed of our family." The kitchen went dead silent. Betty read the note once, then read it again, her breath hitching sharply. The paper shook violently in her grasp, and then, right there on the linoleum floor of my kitchen, my sharp, arrogant, unbothered sister completely collapsed. Betty dropped straight to her knees, burying her face against Emma's little legs, wrapping her arms around my daughter's knees as raw, uncontrollable sobs racked her body. It wasn't strategic crying. It was the ugly, agonizing breakdown of a woman whose pride had been shattered into pieces. "I'm so sorry, Emma." Betty wept hysterically, her voice muffled against Emma's sweater. "I'm so sorry, baby. I was so bitter and jealous ever since Dad died. Dave was giving you all his love and focus, and I felt so alone and forgotten that I wanted to make you feel as small as I felt inside. I was cruel to you, and you didn't deserve a single word of it." Emma stood there in the middle of the kitchen, looking down at her crying aunt. Then, with the quiet grace of a 9-year-old child who possessed more maturity than the adults around her, Emma patted Betty twice on the shoulder. "It's okay, Aunt Betty," Emma whispered softly. "Dad says everyone can change if they truly want to." Betty stayed on her knees, crying into the floor, realizing that the little girl she had tried to label a mistake had just handed her a lesson in unconditional humanity. I gently pulled Betty up from the floor and guided her into a chair at the kitchen table. Emma patted her shoulder one last time before going back to her science worksheet, completely unbothered now, as if the storm had finally passed through our house. I put the kettle on the stove, poured 2 mugs of hot tea, and sat down across from my sister. We talked for an hour. Really talked. No deflections, no playing the victim, no pointing fingers. Betty spoke openly about the terrifying insecurity she had felt ever since our dad passed away, and how she had quietly allowed my constant financial support to morph into a toxic sense of entitlement. "Did I excuse what you said to Emma at that dinner table?" I asked her, my voice low but firm. "No, that can never happen again, Betty. Not to her, not to anyone in this family. What you said was incredibly cruel, and I frankly do not care about the psychology behind why you said it. A child is never a punching bag for your adult insecurities." "I know," Betty whispered, staring down into her tea. "I know, Dave. And I promise you I will never speak to her or anyone else like that again." "Good," I nodded slowly. She looked up at me, a flicker of raw desperation returning to her tired eyes. "So, what happens now, Dave? With the apartment, with the car? If I don't have a cosigner by Friday, my landlord is initiating eviction proceedings." I held her gaze over the rim of my mug. "Emma, forgiving you is about her heart. Betty, it's about her moving forward without carrying anger. But her forgiveness does not mean I am opening my wallet back up to you." Betty blinked, the reality crashing down on her. "I am not signing another lease guarantee," I stated clearly. "I am not reinstating your auto insurance, and I am not paying for your tuition." "Dave, please," she begged softly. "I can't survive out there on my own salary. Then you need to change your salary, or change how you live," I told her, uncompromising and resolute. "Listen to me closely, Betty. The fear and discomfort you are feeling right now, the panic about your lease and your car, that is not me punishing you. That is simply the natural consequence of your own choices. For 3 years, I shielded you from consequence, and it turned you into a person who thought it was acceptable to bully a 9-year-old girl. You have to learn how to carry the weight of your own life now." I watched the fight drain out of her. She didn't scream, she didn't threaten to call my boss, and she didn't blame me. She just sat there, nodded slowly, and accepted the burden of adulthood. Over the next 2 weeks, Betty did exactly what she had to do. She packed up her expensive apartment in the Oregon district and broke her lease, moving into a much smaller, older 1-bedroom unit over in Kettering that she could actually afford on her own salary. She picked up a weekend shift at a local coffee shop to cover the gap in her income, but the real turning point happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I came home from the office to find a small, padded shipping box sitting on my front porch in Riverside. I brought it inside and opened it on the kitchen counter. Inside was a cashier's check made out to me for $850, folded inside a handwritten note, "Dave." The note read, "I sold the designer handbag to a consignment shop in Beaver Creek. I know this doesn't even cover a fraction of the $50,000 you spent on me over the years, but it's a start. I paid for my own groceries this week. It was hard, but it felt right. Thank you for making me grow up." I held that check in my hand and felt a deep sense of relief wash over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking at a dependent who viewed me as an ATM. I was finally looking at a sister learning how to stand on her own 2 feet. The Sunday family dinners on Glenmore Avenue started back up in January. The winter air in Dayton was biting cold, but inside my mother's house, the atmosphere felt completely different from the suffocating tension that had filled the room 4 months earlier. It was quieter now, certainly less boisterous, but there was an unmistakable layer of genuine honesty and mutual respect settling over the table. The toxic entitlement and passive enabling that had poisoned our family for years had finally been cleared away. Betty came to dinner that evening. She didn't arrive in a designer outfit, and she didn't act like the center of the universe. She sat near the middle of the table, quietly passing dishes and speaking with a humble, grounded calm that I hadn't seen in her since we were kids. Before we sat down to eat, Betty walked over to where Emma was sitting, holding a small paper-wrapped package. She set it gently on the table in front of my daughter. "I remembered from a dinner last year that you love mystery stories about dogs," Betty said softly, her voice filled with gentle warmth. "I found this at a local bookstore, and I thought of you." Emma looked at the package, then up at her aunt. She carefully unwrapped it to reveal a hardback mystery book about a young detective girl and her golden retriever. Emma traced the cover, then looked Betty straight in the eye with those big, thoughtful brown eyes. "Thank you, Aunt Betty," Emma said politely, her voice sweet and composed. "That was really nice of you." Progress in a broken family doesn't always look like a movie ending with big cinematic hugs. Sometimes, real healing looks like a 9-year-old girl saying a polite thank you over a book about a dog. It was a small step, a quiet step, but it was real. I sat beside my daughter, resting my hand on her back, feeling a quiet warmth bloom in my chest. My mother had spent the morning in her kitchen making her famous fried chicken, the real Midwest kind, seasoned overnight and fried slow in iron skillets. The kitchen smelled like crisp batter, warm cornbread, and home. As we passed the bowls of mac and cheese, Uncle Gary walked up behind my chair, set a cold beer on the table, and gave my shoulder a firm squeeze. "I had no idea how much weight you were carrying for this family, son," Gary whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. And I'm sorry for what I said on the phone." I looked up at my uncle, shook his hand, and told him it was okay. Because it really was. We ate together that night, not as a family pretending everything was perfect, but as a family that had been broken, repaired, and was finally learning what we truly owed to one another. There was no fake laughter, no rug sweeping, and no toxic boundaries being crossed. Just good food, real conversation, and absolute respect for my daughter. On the drive back to Kettering that night, Emma fell asleep in the passenger seat, holding her new book tightly against her coat. On Monday morning, her teacher handed back her water cycle science project. Emma scored a 97. She was annoyed about the 3 points she missed, telling me she knew exactly what detail she had gotten wrong. That's my kid. Smart, resilient, unbreakable. She is my whole reason. I want to close this story with something for everyone listening today. The discomfort my family felt during those weeks wasn't cruelty. It was consequence. And consequence is never the same thing as revenge. The real victory wasn't cutting people off. It was putting down a burden that was never mine to carry so I could protect the little girl who needed me most. My name is Dave Lewis. And in my life, protecting my daughter comes before everyone else's ego. Always. If you enjoyed this story of real justice, firm boundaries, and protecting family, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below letting me know where in the world you're watching from today. And subscribe so you never miss another episode on Dad's Ultimate Payback. Stay strong, hold your ground, and I'll see you on the next one.